Hello, my name is Ahmad Ward, and I'm the executive director at the historic Mitchellville Freedom Park. Mitchellville is the first self governed town of formerly enslaved people in the United States, founded on Hilton Island in 1862. This is where we believe freedom began for Africans in America because they had a chance to be citizens of their own communities, to have land ownership, to start businesses, to protect their families, and have something that they could call their own. The concept of freedom in that is very, very important, which is why we are very pleased to be taking part in this year's MLK observance with the Hilton Head Committee for Justice. And so, what I've been asked to do is talk to you a little bit about King, and we want to kind of give it uh, a different way of thinking about it. Something that I have heard a lot over the last 10 years or so, especially with all the events and with racial unrest, with young Black men and women being killed by police and others who have been unarmed or otherwise non threatening, is the familiar drumbeat of what would Dr. King say? Or Dr. King would not like what you were doing. What would Dr. King think about what is happening in the streets of America? And it's usually couched in a way to make people of color be quiet. And so, what I like to do in the next few minutes is to talk about uh, what indeed MLK would do in these situations. And we're going to use some history and some of his own words to get us there. And so bear with me. Some of this may be inconvenient for those who are watching who might not be familiar with this side of King or what historians know King to be, specifically in the years after the March on Washington leading up to his death on April the 4th, 1968. Before I came to the low country of South Carolina, I spent 18 years of my life at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, where, of course, we talked about Dr. King and his legacy because we spoke about the entire civil rights movement in America, and specifically King's involvement in the Birmingham campaign and the writing of the letter from Birmingham jail. That organization, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, actually has the jail cell door from the cell that King was imprisoned behind in 1963. And so this is where he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail that was in response to some area white pastors who basically thought that King was moving too fast, that the movement was going to hamstring all the efforts that had been happening with local business people trying to gain some level of equality, and would disrupt any kind of peace in the area. But I'm not going to concentrate so much on that letter. One of the things that we hear more than anything when people talk about King is that one quote that everybody knows, and it is slightly grating to people like myself and others who have been studying King and talking about King for so long, for this man's entire life, this incredible person's entire life, to be couched in the one quote that we see so often. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This is an important quote. This is part of the dream that Dr. King had during that speech, but it was a dream at the time. And this quote has been used, as I mentioned earlier, to silence critics who are speaking about America or other injustices that are happening specific to them from other people who don't want to hear it. What has happened, unfortunately, to King in the years since his assassination, and we must say what it is, he was assassinated, is he has been turned into a lofty goal, a nonviolent specter. When he was alive, the very action of the nonviolent protest that he was shepherding, along with others like Fred Shuttlesworth and Ralph Abernathy, was called violent. Uh, all of the things that you have heard being said about Black Lives Matter protesters over the last few years have specifically been said about King and the civil rights movement. And I think that that's something that folks have kind of lost sight of. And so, what we want to do here is talk a little bit about King's history and kind of make sure these things line up. Would King actually be for the things that had happened, specifically in 2020 and before, in regards to people trying to say, hey, Black people are being killed indiscriminately for reasons that don't make sense. And we need to look at the issues that surround that. Okay. Um, First of all, we must say King was not violent. That is very true. But he understood all the things that went around in this country, the notion of race and class. And America's history is far from nonviolent. And so, in looking at this as a whole, we got to go back to the March on Washington because that quote came from that, correct? And so, in 1963, most Americans disapproved of the event. Congress thought it was seditious. You had military surrounding the mall on Washington, ready to move in at a moment's notice if something were to happen. Even though this was always stated as a peaceful protest and folks were moving into Washington to express their opinions about what could be done to get us further along to what American ideals are supposed to be like. But it is after that speech at the March on Washington that the FBI, with President Kennedy's approval, we want to say, um, decided to increase their monitoring of the civil rights leader. The FBI described King as demagogic and the most dangerous person to the nation from the standpoint of national security. This person that we hold out as the harbinger of peace, the drum major for peace, was at one point considered the greatest threat to this nation by its government. Attorney General Robert Kennedy signed off on intrusive surveillance of his living quarters, offices, phones, hotel rooms, as well as those as everybody associated with Dr. King. When MLK took that podium on August 28th, 1963, the Department of Justice was there in Washington. Fearing that someone might hijack the microphone and make inflammatory statements, the DOJ came up with a plan to silence the speaker just in case. If something would happen, there was an officer seated next to the sound system, holding a recording of Mahalia Jackson singing "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands," which he planned to play to placate the crowd. There's another whole conversation about that statement, but we won't go into detail there about how that music was going to placate folks who, for years, and in fact, at that point, 100 years, fought to get the same rights and privileges they should have been afforded after the ending of the Civil War. Our popular memory of the civil rights movement is that everybody was in favor, but most of these people were not in favor of this movement. The movement was deeply unpopular at the time. Most Americans thought it was going too far. Movement artists, the people who were there, activists, were being too extreme. And most Americans were happy with status quo. In the 1960s, the vast majority of white people, North and South, disapproved. In a May 1961 Gallup survey, only 22% of Americans approved of what the Freedom Riders were doing. And 57% of Americans said that sit ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations by Negroes, called that at the time, were hurting the Negroes' chances of being integrated in the South. Only 23% of Americans had a favorable opinion of proposed civil rights demonstrations. Nearly half say that those picketing and demonstrating after 1964, when the act was actually passed, said that picketing and demonstrations hurt the Negro cause, and 80% opposed school pairings to promote school segregation in public schools in large cities. You would say, okay, that makes sense, Ahmad. You know, we're talking about a different time here. Of course, they weren't opposed to that. Of course, they weren't with that. But what was the view of King? In 1966, a year after Selma, and the patches of the Voting Rights Act, only 36% of white people said King was helping the cause. 30% of black respondents felt the same as demonstrations by Negroes on civil rights hurting the advancement of the cause. 85% of white people felt that it was hurting. 72% of Americans had an unfavorable view of King in 1966. But we love King so much now, right? He is held out there as the most admired Americans, in some cases above FDR and Kennedy. But at the time, between 63 and 68, King was hated. And partially because of his changing views on the wars, I should say, outside of America, and poverty. And that's really where things begin to get even dicier for Dr. King and his work. King said, shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding of people of ill will. The folks who are supposed to be with us, not really understanding is more frustrating. You can expect folks on the other side to feel the way that they feel, but folks just not to understand the core of what the movement folks were saying is what vexed King. It's the same thing that vexes people who are saying they don't believe that Black Lives Matter more than other lives. It's just that right now, Black lives don't seem to matter that much. There is a difference. And we have removed part of what King was fighting for in our conversations about Dr. King. He was moving for everyone to be together. That is correct. That is very correct. He wanted peace for everyone. But in that, as a core element, was he was trying to work for the advancement and betterment of Black people. It is impossible to create a formula for the future, which does not take into account that our society has been doing something special against the Negro for hundreds of years. And so he acknowledged that there were issues that specifically kept Black people down. And he was trying to root out those things and bring it to the forefront so that we all can deal with them specifically. Now, there are some other quotes here, and I'll go through some of these that will get us into that realm of inconvenient. I often in conversation talk about the inconvenient king, and there's been a lot of articles written about it because we always go back to that first quote. This is all we consider of King. This is a great thing to think about, right? This is what we all want. But is it reality? And I would venture to say that we haven't quite gotten there yet when we look at health disparities, when we look at education systems, when we look at the prison industrial complex. We aren't really there yet, which is part and parcel of the conversations around Black Lives Matter protests and murders of people like George Floyd and Alton Sterling and Breonna Taylor and others who lost their lives for no reason at all. One of the things that King said that you heard recently, but up until recently, this was never said. A riot is the language of the unheard. And he basically acknowledged that when people are not being listened to, when folks feel that their words are not being heard, then they will react in any way possible to make sure that they can be heard. I'm going to read a passage to you here. King talked about the role of behavioral scientists in the civil rights movement. This is a dissertation at the American Psychology Association's annual conference in Washington, D.C. on September the 1st, 1967. And this is something that I think some people will not be able to stomach completely well. Urban riots must now be recognized as durable social phenomena. They may be deplored, but they are there and should be understood. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. I might let that one sit for a minute. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. We've seen insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or to attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. They are a distorted form of social protest. The looting, which is their principal feature, serves many functions. It enables the most enraged and deprived Negro to take hold of consumer goods with the ease the white man does by using his purse. Often, the Negro does not even want what he takes, he wants the experience of taking. He added, let us say boldly that if the violations of law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the law breaking of a few days of riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. These are often difficult things to say, but I have come to see more and more that it is necessary to utter the truth in order to deal with the great problems that we face in our society. Now, I didn't put that into the speech to talk about white versus black, but you needed to understand the things that this person was saying. His understanding of what urban riot meant, his understanding of when people are pushed with their backs against the wall, they will react in ways that will be deemed deplorable or otherwise. One of the things that frustrates members of the Black Lives Matter movement and folks who are associated is the equivalence that people will give to property in regards to human life. Most of us don't believe in property damage and burning things down and things of that nature. But when buildings are giving the same heft and value as a human life, it takes us back to a time where those same human lives were considered property. That's what we think about when we hear that. And that's something that we haven't quite gotten away from if a storefront window has the same value as a man who had his neck kneeled on for 8 minutes. And I'd like for you to keep that in mind. Until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears the soul of this nation. King was all about justice. That was the message, justice and opportunity. Like, we can't talk about healing when we haven't had accountability. And it has to be opportunity and justice. Justice is accountability. Accountability is justice. And that's what he was trying to get us to understand. Harry Belafonte shared a moment about Dr. King when he realized that integration might have been an issue. The last time they were together at Belafonte's house before King was assassinated, he seemed agitated and preoccupied. And so Belafonte asked him, what's going on? And according to Belafonte, King responded, I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply. We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have. And I know we will win. But I've come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house. I'm afraid that America has lost the moral vision that she may have had. And I'm afraid that even as we integrate, we are walking into a place that does not understand that this nation needs to be deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and disenfranchised. Until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears the soul of this nation. I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house. At this time, King had been disillusioned, demoralized by the efforts not going the way that he had liked for them to go. He had advisors saying that his strategy about economic justice was a bad one. And his continued speaking out against the war would be an issue. In fact, his own son, MLK III, has stated that they believe that his vocal opposition to the war, and the creation of the Poor People's Campaign is what led for him being killed, because they understood that he could move masses. He could engender feelings in people to get them to act. And if this person started talking about changing distribution of wealth, okay, the problems of racial injustice, economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. When someone who has that kind of reach starts saying those things, then he is deemed dangerous for people who may not want to see that happen. On April the 4th, 1967, King spoke at Riverside Church in New York, and that's when he made the strong comments about America's involvement in the Vietnam War. And it was at that point that a year from that point to the day he was killed, a year later, King was just completely ostracized by people, including NAACP and others who felt that he had gone entirely too far. Um, and so the last year of King's life, he was really struggling with where he saw things going. He was struggling with the vision that he had seen. But even with all that, he was able to persevere and to keep moving. And so we didn't want to go through all that and give this negative view of what's happening now. We want you to understand what MLK would do. He would be supportive of those who could not be heard. He would be supportive of those who were trying to push the country into a measure of understanding where people are coming from and trying to fix things. He was lawful, even in the conversations about breaking unjust laws. He probably wouldn't have stormed the Capitol. But he would have been in support of people trying to use their voices to make change. In 1983, the year that Ronald Reagan grudgingly signed MLK Day into law, he was asked if King was a communist sympathizer. He said, "We'll know in 35 years, won't we?" Referring to the eventual release of FBI surveillance tapes. You're dealing with someone here who was surveilled when there was rumors about extramarital affairs. The FBI sent him a note saying you know what you should do, basically trying to get him to commit suicide. They infiltrated rather every element of his life, trying to destroy him, and ultimately he was killed for his views. But the message still remains for justice and opportunity. The message still remains that we must do the things that we need to do to get us to a better place. What would MLK do? He would be out there in the streets with those young people who were protesting. He would be sympathetic to the cause. He would be understanding of where they were coming from. In his own words, hope is the final refusal to give up. And that statement is what even kept him in those last 5 years of his life, when the world had seemingly turned away from him. And even inside, he had these internal battles about if they were doing the right thing and how could they get the point across. I want to go back to Belafonte as I close here. Belafonte added, "That statement took me aback. It was the last thing I would have expected to hear, considering the nature of our struggle." And so Belafonte asked King, "What should we do?" And King replied that we should become the firemen. King said, "Let us not stand by and let the house burn." And so King would not stand by and let the house burn. He would be involved. He would share his voice. And we can do the same thing. In our efforts to honor King, let us not deify him to the point where young people can't feel that they can get to his level. And all of those schools that I went to in Alabama when I was talking about civil rights movement, and specifically we talk about King. I wanted to make sure that young people understood that you could be king tomorrow. We want to talk about all the great things King did, but we want to put him on so high a pedestal that young people and the young at heart think they can't get to his level. If you want to create change, you can create change today. You can make things happen today. You can be powerful today, just like he was, and just like he still is. So remember, it's a day on, not a day off for King observances. I hope that you will try to live the values that he lived. And remember, what would King do? He wouldn't let the house burn. So let's all be firemen. Thank you.